This is the story of two coaches and their two approaches to motivation. One was my 6th grade football coach. We'll call him Coach Burns. Coach Burns was a walking stereotype, channeling the Hollywood prototype, a coach who seemed to think that the volume of his voice was more important than the content of his words. Like most coaches, he was great at telling kids what to do, but he wasn't always as great at teaching them how to do it. And it is appropriate that he was an avid Packers fan because his coaching style was based on a mythical view of Vince Lombardi, and the idea if you yell loud enough and make the right kind of threats, you can get the most out of people. People in this case being 6th grade boys. The second was a 6th grade select baseball coach. We'll call him Coach Diaz. He was listed as the manager, but he acted more like a CEO. He was an engineer by profession who spent his days designing components for military technologies. Now, he wasn't exactly a rocket scientist. He was more of a missile scientist, and he approached the management of his baseball team in the same way he approached engineering projects. The first thing he did after recruiting players to form a team was recruit the most talented baseball coaches he could find. He got the hitting and pitching coaches from a local university to serve as his hitting and pitching coaches for the team, and he recruited me to coach the catchers. And while serving as an assistant, I got to see excellence in coaching up close. Now, to explain the difference between Coach Burns and Coach Diaz, I'm going to enlist the help of Dan Pink, the author of Drive. In Drive, Dan Pink translates decades of basic psychology research into actionable intelligence for business leaders. But his summary is great for understanding motivation in coaching as well. In particular, he draws upon classical and operant conditioning and self-determination theory. Dan Pink summarizes popular thinking on motivation with a computer software metaphor. The first version of software used to understand what drives behavior is Motivation 1.0, which involves the fulfillment of basic biological urges such as food, water, safety, shelter, and sex. So long as we're talking about well-fed athletes who live in a reasonably safe place, Motivation 1.0 doesn't help us too much in understanding how to influence the behavior of young athletes. So let's move on to Motivation 2.0. Motivation 2.0 is basically classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Leaders who are operating with Motivation 2.0 focus on using carrots and sticks to influence behavior, believing that incentives and punishment provide the best options for understanding why people behave as they do. Using Motivation 2.0, the belief is that leadership involves knowing which types of carrots to offer subordinates and which types of sticks to use when subordinates don't do as they're told. Coach Burns was clearly running the Motivation 2.0 operating system. Like so many coaches before him and after, Coach Burns used exercise as a stick. If a player made a mistake, Coach Burns blew his whistle and made the child run or do push-ups or sit-ups, or if he was really angry with the child, he would have them go up against his son in a tackling drill. Going up against his son was a pretty hefty stick because he had taught his son how to spear, i.e. drive the crown of his head into the stomach of opponents. And if players didn't hit hard enough in tackling drills, he would banish them to Lover's Corner on the far side of the field, which involved a bit of exercise, but also a hefty dose of humiliation. But like most coaches, Coach Burns also used carrots, offering incentives to players, especially his son. For every tackle his son made, he got $1, and he provided rewards for the kids who played the best. At the end of the season, in addition to the participation trophies that we all received, some of us got a special coach's award, which was a second trophy. Coach Burns really wanted to win, and he reminded us that he wanted to win often. And we did win most of our games, but just because we were good doesn't mean we were doing our best. Coach Burns' carrots and sticks approach was based on fear. And our quarterback was so scared before 6th grade competitions that he would vomit on the sidelines a few minutes before every game. Most of the players learned to obey the coach, but when unexpected things happened in the game, the players didn't know what to do. We were trained to follow orders, not follow principles. We joined a football team because we were interested in playing football. That is, we brought our intrinsic motivation with us. But for many of us, at least at some degree, our intrinsic motivation was replaced by extrinsic motivation. We went from autonomous kids to controlled kids, and that is why things tended to break down when the other team implemented a type of play we hadn't seen before. In behaviorist terms, reinforcement, i.e. carrots, and punishment, i.e. sticks, works reasonably well for algorithmic tasks, those in which a simple procedure is repeated, like tackling a running back. But reinforcement and punishment don't work as well for heuristic tasks, those that require creativity or finding a solution to a novel problem, like reading an offense or to some extent defending the option. So when we played against the option, at least the 6th grade version of the option offense, we got beaten by a much slower team. Although we were generally pretty good at outscoring opponents, I don't think Coach Byrne helped us reach our potential as players and as a team. And he certainly didn't build character in us, as coaches like to proclaim. In fact, he probably made us worse kids. And that is what the carrots and sticks approach tends to do. The carrots and sticks approach narrows focus on outcomes. And when that happens, we tend to lose focus on the process, and with that, sometimes we lose focus on the right and wrong of what we are doing. As players, we were so focused on obeying orders to avoid running laps or listening to mild verbal abuse, we were willing to do pretty much anything, including tactics that weren't precisely in line with the rules of football or normal human decency. There are much worse coaches than Coach Burns. And I do think that Coach Burns thought he was providing a great benefit to us. I just think that he was basing his actions on faulty intelligence, believing that his version of Motivation 2.0 was the best way of coaching 6th graders. But there are much better ways to coach. Coach Diaz didn't understand baseball particularly well. That is why he recruited a team of experts to assist him. But he understood people, and he understood motivation. To use Dan Pink's term, Coach Diaz was operating with Motivation 3.0. The guts of Motivation 3.0, the underlying code, if you will, is based on Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory. Motivation 3.0 is the idea that, unlike lab rats, people are not primarily motivated by rewards and punishment so long as their basic needs are met. Rather, people are motivated by mastery, autonomy, and purpose. Coach Diaz, being an engineer, approached coaching as an engineer would. He broke down the game of baseball into the component skills, hitting, base running, fielding, throwing, and figured out a way to promote the acquisition of those skills in his players as efficiently as possible, using the resources available. Rather than standing around listening to Coach Diaz talk, the players spent almost the entirety of every practice rotating through a series of 5-minute stations. In one station, 2 players might be hitting bottle caps with a broomstick behind a dugout, in another, hitting live pitching from home plate, or practicing sliding near a foul pole, while 2 other players were hitting off a tee behind the backstop. And after 5 minutes, a buzzer would sound and the players would rotate 2 by 2 to the next station. The drills were designed to help the players master basic baseball fundamentals. And the clock provided a sense of urgency. Once all the players had rotated through the stations, a new set of stations would be waiting for them. 12-year-old boys aren't known to be the most perfectly behaved demographic, but there was never, ever a behavioral problem at our practices. And this is not because Coach Diaz had bribed the players with promises of ice cream or a pizza party or given out gold stars or medals of honor for good behavior. And it certainly wasn't because the players were afraid Coach Diaz would yell at them or make them run. The lack of behavior problems was the result of the structure of training sessions. According to Motivation 3.0, people are naturally motivated to achieve mastery. And the carefully designed drills included in each station offered something for the kids to master. The drills were realistically challenging so that 12-year-old baseball players could improve their skills with repeated practice, without getting bored or frustrated. And when new skills were introduced, Coach Diaz was pretty good about structuring things around the 4 laws of learning: explanation, demonstration, imitation, and repetition. Because practices were so efficient, the players didn't waste time standing in line or listening to a coach ramble on. They were able to get a lot of repetitions in each station. Since there were more stations than coaches, many of the stations were unsupervised. The kids were given the autonomy to work together without a parent or coach hovering over them. One player would place a series of balls on a tee for his teammate, then they would keep switching until a 5-minute period elapsed. And when coaches were assisting with stations, they provided limited feedback, allowing each child to try and try and try again without constant evaluation. This worked well for kids because it was consistent with the desire for autonomy. Kids like assistance and advice, but insistence is a vice for many youth sport coaches. Some coaches will provide a constant flow of feedback, evaluating every swing of the bat, acting as if the child is a remote control car and they have the radio. This is the opposite of autonomy. Attempting to micromanage the behavior of a child is unnecessary because their need for mastery is providing plenty of motivation for them. And controlling a young athlete's every move is counterproductive because it can take away from a child's sense of autonomy. But so many coaches do this habitually, and when children feel controlled, they lose motivation. And what do coaches do? They reach for a stick. For mediocre coaches, their default is motivation 2.0. And motivation 2.0 is a vicious cycle. Use sticks and carrots to manipulate behavior, taking away the motivation that comes from autonomously striving to master a task, thereby creating an even greater need for carrots and sticks to control behavior. Most coaches operate on motivation 2.0 because they don't have any better ideas. They are stuck in the reward and punishment paradigm. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of introducing Stone Chambade to a group of students and coaches. Stone operates on motivation 3.0. Stone shared about his Wolves football program, which attracts street kids from Kampala to a place where they can play football, connect with new friends, and learn the skills that they will need to face future responsibilities as husbands and fathers and employees and citizens of Uganda. Stone talked about how he always tries to lead by example but is equally proactive about teaching with words, devoting practice time to principles that will help them on and off the field. The idea that a soccer team can be so much more than a soccer team has imbued the Wolves players with a tremendous sense of purpose, the third component of motivation 3.0, the one that even Coach Diaz hadn't mastered. This sense of purpose is palpable in the Wolves program. The boys are not just there to play soccer, but to become self-sufficient young men. And that is one reason why motivation is never a problem among the Wolves, even when Stone is not around. After discussing his Wolves program, an experienced coach in the audience raised his hand and asked, "But what do you do to discipline your players when they misbehave?" What this audience member was really asking is, what kind of sticks do you use to beat your players into obedience? Stone calmly explained that if you anticipate what the players need to learn and anticipate what sort of challenges they will face on and off the field, you can be proactive about teaching them the skills that they need to manage their own behavior. Then there won't be any problematic behavior to punish. After hearing Stone's profound and eloquent answer to this very understandable question, the experienced coach once again raised his hand and asked, "But how do you discipline your players? I mean, do you make them run?" The thinking of this experienced coach is not at all unusual. In fact, in my experience, he's pretty typical. Just another coach stuck in a carrots and sticks paradigm. And these are the types of coaches who like to tell me just how unmotivated their players are when they find out I have a PhD in sports psychology. Sometimes they even invite me to come motivate their players. But in truth, the problem rests not with the players, but with the coach. And as politely and diplomatically as possible, my response is always this: a critically important principle that all coaches need to understand: you can't change their behavior unless you first change your behavior. And for many coaches, if they're going to change their behavior, they're going to need to upgrade their operating system from a Motivation 2.0 carrots and sticks approach to a Motivation 3.0 approach, which recognizes the fact that incentives only go so far, but autonomy, mastery, and purpose go much further.